All right.
There you go.
Okay, so apologies to the first two people who made comments that are not recorded. Cockpit error on this side.
As for those of you, the public are concerned about our work with the town, as you will hear, one of our members is Nan Shustak, and she is our liaison with the town. And she is going to be the one to help us communicate between you and the committee. You members of the public and the committee. Are there any other comments under oral communications? If not, we will move on to old business. And the old business of the day is the meeting of the last, or the minutes of the last meeting, which was 5 years ago. Are there any corrections and comments about those minutes?
I have just, Chet, it's Nan. I have just one correction, spelling correction. The TOWN should be in the header of the meeting. It's a typo.
That's important.
Yeah, yeah, and I do have a question. I just wanted to clarify that these minutes pertain only to the relocation of segments of the San Andreas Fault. Is that right?
That's what the meeting was about. Yeah, okay. I will tell you a few things about that. But let's I guess I can make a motion that we accept the minutes with the corrections that have been suggested.
Chet, you have a comment. You have a hand raised to comment on the minutes.
Rusty Day, Bob.
Okay. I'm sorry. Are there any further comments?
Yeah, we got.
Yeah, we have one.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a comment. I noticed the minutes are approving the 2017 ground movement map. And in that map, a change was made between that and the previous map to delete from the map a trace of the Hermit Fault from West Ridge, across Stanford's property and into Alpine Road. And that was deleted from the map. I didn't see any discussion of that in the minutes. I didn't see any explanation for that deletion. I'm asking whether that was addressed by the committee and approved by the committee at the 2017 meeting or not.
It was not brought up at the 2017 meeting. We were not involved in that removed in any way with the geology in that area at that time. It was any decisions that were made about that area were made by the town geologist. We were focused in the committee meeting about the San Andreas Fault because a publication for which I was the lead author and my son Bob here was second author, and the town geologist then Ted Sayer was working with us as an author on that report. And so we recognized in discussions with Ted Sayer that the town geologic map needed to be improved. So we set about to try to make some suggestions for the improvements. And that's what we did. One of the most interesting things that happened in the meeting was that we were concerned about how the San Andreas Fault along Alpine Road near
Indian Crossing?
Just beyond Indian Crossing should be shown. Should it be shown as a solid line indicating that we know exactly where it is, or should it be shown as a dashed line, which would indicate that it's approximately located? Despite my feelings that it should have been shown as a solid line, the committee ultimately approved it as being shown as a dashed line. And we made other decisions about faults that had been shown previously as part of the San Andreas system, Some of them were falsely shown. So we just were trying to correct the town geologic map for the San Andreas Fault as we knew it at that time.
Okay. Okay. I move that we approve the minutes.
You have one more comment.
I have oh, I'm sorry. I have something on my screen. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Perhaps this is a question for Jeff. Because the committee members, current committee members are different than the members that were on the committee in 2017 that made these minutes, and how would this particular committee at this time be able to vote to approve these minutes? Jeff, is there something different, a different procedure that would then allow this current group to then approve these minutes, or how is that done?
This group can vote to approve or they can abstain. I mean, Chet was a member of the committee then. He could be the sole vote if he chose to. It's the committee member, it is up to the committee members. They can in fact vote to approve them if they have no significant concerns with them, or they could vote to abstain and Chet could vote to approve it. I would recommend just approving this and having it on the record as approved minutes.
I make the motion that we approve the minutes with the correction noted.
I'll abstain.
Oh, you need a second. I'll second the motion. You're abstaining. I'll second, but I think I'm going to abstain also. So Chet, you get to vote.
I vote for, well, I've already said that I vote for it. And anybody else wish to vote for it? Or maybe no comment is needed.
Yeah.
So can we move on?
So the minutes are approved? That's the action item. The minutes are approved with the correction.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. And let's see the next item, Bob.
Oh, selection of officers.
Oh, yes. We're going to select officers of the committee, but first let me tell you about the current committee. Everybody in the town who's interested in the Geologic Safety Committee should know who is on it. First, I will mention Gary Ernst, who could not be with us today. Gary is a Stanford emeritus professor. He has received the highest award given to geologists in the United States. He's a truly, truly marvelous man, and we are very lucky to have him on the committee. He does not want to be an officer, but wants to be able to advise us and help us in any way, and we appreciate that. Next person to be added to the committee is Nan Shustak, and many of you in the town government already know her. She's made herself known. She has been a lecturer at San Jose State. She's very interested in the geology of Portola Valley. Nan, would you like to add a sentence or two about your career?
Oh, just I've spent the last, I don't know, 15 years studying local geology and up and down the peninsula. And Portola Valley was one of my particularly favorite spots to study. So yeah, as you say, I'm extremely interested in local geology and the regional geology.
Thank you. We're lucky to have somebody so interested in the local geology. The most recent member of the committee added to the committee is Pat McCrory. By the way, all members of the committee are members of the town of Portola Valley. We all live here. Pat has worked with the U.S. Geological Survey. She recently retired and has remained as an emeritus with the Geological Survey. Pat, would you tell us a little bit of what you'd like us to know about your career?
Oh, well, my focus was earthquake science. So, and I guess I have to say that's because my family moved here to Portola Valley in 1959. So my time in the Portola Valley schools, I always heard about the big San Francisco earthquake that ruptured in front of the Little Red Schoolhouse and how it was going to reoccur again any day now. So I kept waiting my whole childhood for this second big San Andreas earthquake. So that I think piqued my interest. And so I spent the last several decades focused on earthquake science, both in California and also Oregon, Washington, principally.
Lastly, I'll say a few words about myself. I have had a career with the U.S. Geological Survey. I consider myself a field geologist. I have worked from the border with Mexico to the Arctic shore, and spent some time in Alaska. And I am currently writing what I hope will be a major paper on the geology of South Central Alaska, including Mount Denali. So I think that's enough. We're ready to move on. I'm glad that everybody here now knows something about the members of the committee. We're all committed very much to trying to understand the geology of Portola Valley and to help the town as best we can. So the next item on the business on the is
to select committee officers.
So we're going to elect committee officers. I guess I, Chet Rucky, am willing to remain as chair, at least for the remainder of this calendar year. I ask the committee for your help in giving me that office.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'd like to, so all those in favor, please say aye.
Okay. Aye. Oh, Jeff, is this how it's done?
It's really up to you how it's done. I mean, you could call for a nomination. I mean, Chet's nominated himself. You're welcome. I mean, unless you object to that, it's fine. However you guys want to do it.
All right. So
no, that's fine. It's I would very much like to have Chet as chair. So yes.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, yes.
Next, we would like Pat McCrory to be our secretary. And are you willing to do that, Pat?
Yes.
And I would imagine everybody would be happy to have you do that. If that's are you happy with that, Nan?
I'm very happy with that. Thank you. Thank you, Pat.
All right. So Pat, you're in.
Okay. Thank you.
Nan herself, we would like you to be the official liaison between the committee and the town government. You have in fact been doing that, but we would like it to be officially so.
That's fine.
You are so nominated, and I hope you would accept that position.
I do. Thank you.
And I also would like
I approve
to be co-chair of the committee, because she is so very much involved with the town. It would be very helpful if she had that position as co-chair of the Geologic Safety Committee. Is that, are you willing to accept that?
Yes, I will.
Pat, is that all right with you?
Yeah, I approve.
Good. Let's see. Oh, yes. Bob Rucky here, my son, is not a member of the committee, but the committee members have been using him as a computer consultant because he knows the computer world very well, and he also knows geology, having studied geology at Humboldt State, and he's followed me around in my career all over the place, including Alaska. It's very helpful. So we would like him to be an official consultant for our committee. Are you willing to do that, Bob?
I am. Mostly my contribution is the ability to make maps, and I leave the geology to the geologists.
But I know Bob's knowledge of geology is really quite incredible. I put him through some good oral examinations.
That's true.
Next item on the agenda is the policy that we are going to adopt for communications during meetings. And about the only thing I can suggest is that communications to the committee should be held as close to just 2 minutes as possible. Keep them short so the committee can move along to more important things. Is that acceptable to other members of the committee?
Yes.
2
it
minutes,
is.
2-minute
Yeah.
discussions?
Do we have, Jeff, do we have to vote on this officially, or is it?
You could, what you could do is just take sort of, I mean, several, the council and several other committees have sort of a broader policy, have a policy on comments to them that includes that 2-minute limit. Just to be clear with the public, it might be better to just maybe at the next meeting as a consent item, you could just adopt that, sort of just take one of those, take the policy from one of the other committees, amend that time limit to 2 minutes if it's not already 2 minutes, and just adopt that. That'd be my suggestion, just to set the boundaries clearly.
But for the moment, the 2-minute
you can agree now on the 2 minutes, and then I'll make sure that you have a copy of that policy, and you could just adopt the rest of the policy.
So
Okay, thank you.
The 2 minutes stands for this meeting. Pat, Hernan, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, question. So Jeff, if we adopt the 2-minute policy, can we vary it to allow more time if there's something that really needs more in-depth discussion?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you could waive it for a meeting if you so chose. If you invite a speaker, they're not subject to. If you invite someone agendize a speaker, they're not subject to the 2-minute limit. So yeah, you can always if you need someone to speak longer, they can always speak longer.
Okay. Thanks. Okay.
We'll make sure the speakers do not go over much time. We'll give them ample time.
No.
Man, I would like you to read the official charter for the Geologic Safety Committee. Are you able to do that now?
Yeah, I have it in front of me. Yeah, it was last revised in 2000. It's 3/30/2000. Okay, and it says Geologic Safety Committee objectives: to advise the town council, other town bodies, and town staff or officials as needed on geologic hazards or matters related thereto. Duties and functions. 1, committee shall serve only in an advisory role. 2, to review town ordinances. Lost it. To review town ordinances, policies, plan, and procedures relating to geologic hazards. 3, to review the town's earthquake preparedness and education program in light of geologic hazards. 5, should be 4, to comment on other matters as requested by the town council. Responsible to town council, coordination, council liaison, town planner, town geologist. And the committee shall consist of 5 members. Okay, meetings when needed. That's it. So I do have one question, Chad.
Yes.
And that is, what on earth is the town's earthquake preparedness and education program? Has anyone heard of this?
We have never heard that before. It's totally new to me. Our original charter, as I remember it, when I was on the committee in the 1960s, that we were just to advise the town as the town asked us to provide information on geologic matters.
Okay.
Now, like everything else in the world, things are more complicated. And we've been given a charter that's, which I'm sure we can follow. And this matters of education, I would imagine that, Nan, you could help us with very successfully.
I would, well, what if, okay, I will volunteer to investigate this and find out, see if I can find out anything about a program that was started, possibly dropped, and I'll report back to the committee.
That'd be fine. Thank you. Thank you very much. We've been asked to choose a time for a regular time for meetings. And I think that we have agreed that the 3rd Thursday of the month at 2 o'clock would be a regular time when we could meet if needed. Is the town people find that successful? Is that all right?
I mean, are you, I don't know how many meetings, you guys haven't been meeting a lot, obviously. So, I mean, if you want to schedule that, if you want to set that as a placeholder for regular meetings, but the safety elements coming up, you might just remain as an as needed and leave that as a preference. I don't know. I'm just not sure if there's going to be enough material for you to meet every month.
Well,
Is that your target, or is that sort of?
I just assumed that we would have a meeting if we needed one, and that would be the time to have it.
So you just want to set aside that, just say that when meetings are held, you would try to hold them on the third Thursday of the month.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess
that makes sense.
so we could have a placeholder, have it scheduled and canceled if we don't hold the meeting, because I can imagine, Jeff, that once we get into the safety element, there may be geologic safety committee meetings that are associated with that.
There will be some meetings about this committee, specifically about the safety element. You can leave that third Thursday as a possible time. I mean, there might be a point where you want to have it maybe a little like just if something were to come to you, 3 days after that Thursday, and you didn't want to wait another month to hold a meeting, you could schedule a special meeting sooner than that.
Fine.
But there's no harm in leaving that as kind of your date for as needed, but then you should, you might want to be flexible in terms of, you might want a special meeting at some point that's not on the third Thursday if you want to do something sooner.
Traditionally, this committee has always been very flexible.
Right.
Oh, great. So how are we leaving this then? It would be easier, I think, to have a scheduled meeting time and then cancel it if, just say, okay, we don't have anything to talk about, so we're not going to meet this week. Just have people set aside that, at least committee members set aside that time during the week in case it's needed.
That's very good, Nan. I agree.
Okay, Pat, what do you think?
Sure, yeah, that works for me. That sounds good. It seems like the committee will have more work to do now while the safety updates being discussed. So for now, it seems it's a really good idea to have it meet at least once a month, but in the future, just have it as a placeholder that we can always cancel out.
So I'm sure that Nan will let the other members of the committee know what is current, so that we can decide whether we should have a meeting or not. So that's a job for you, Nan. And I'm sure you've been doing that anyway, so this is nothing new for you. You are very capable in telling us what the town is thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen.
Okay.
Okay.
Wow. It's only in a half an hour, we finally get to the real meeting, real reason for the meeting, which is to have some discussions by two speakers. The first one is Keith Knudsen.
Can I say something? Can we make a public comment on that last item?
Oh, Mary, okay. There's a hand up.
Okay.
Just saying that particularly as you are now an official committee of the town, it's important to meet so that you can talk honestly between yourselves, because of course, the Brown Act. We need to be extremely careful, and this gives you a great opportunity to meet and have public input. But to miss the opportunity of having a monthly scheduled meeting seems like a missed opportunity to communicate with your committee members.
We are aware of the Brown Act, and we can meet one-on-one, and we have done that, and we will do that. We will observe the Brown Act.
Yeah, but Chet, Mary's saying that having a regularly scheduled meeting would give us a chance to meet and talk.
That is very helpful. Yes.
Yeah, without Brown Act restrictions.
That's right. That's a good point for the meetings.
Well, okay, so that's still a question up in the air. Should we adopt a regular meeting time and just say yes for now? I would recommend it. That
yes.
Yes, Pat says yes. Is that okay?
Rita has a comment.
Chet?
Yes, I think we should adopt it.
Rita has a comment.
Okay.
At least for now, regular meeting time, when we know we can get together to discuss whatever we need to discuss, all of us. And then we can change that later if we need to, after we're finished with the safety element.
Right. So are there any other comments?
Yeah. Rita has one.
Rita.
Yes, I hope you can hear me, but I just appreciate, I've been asking in so many meetings, I'm probably that person that's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe she's asking this question again about the Geological Safety Committee in so many town council, planning meeting, housing element meeting. I'm so glad that you're now meeting, as I said in the oral statements, but that if by having a regular scheduled meeting once a month, that we, the public, can then ask questions to this great knowledgeable group. I am just so glad, because I know a lot of different things, but I don't know a whole lot about this. And I live like right on a fault. And I really appreciate being able to come to this meeting. And if I have a question, to ask all of you at one time, because I couldn't ask you to my house for coffee and then ask all of you this question because of the Brown Act, but I can ask you during this meeting. So I really appreciate you putting it on the schedule as a monthly meeting. Thank you. And I know I'm not alone with that idea, but I really appreciate this wealth of knowledge all on one screen or in the meeting room, at the schoolhouse, or wherever. Thank you so much for having a monthly meeting.
Thank you. Well, we now will have them. And by the way, as geologists, we all know that there's always a lot to learn. It's a very broad science, and it's a difficult science in many ways. And we don't all agree about the same things. So
Yeah.
that's just to be expected. Are we now free to move on to the speakers?
Yeah.
All right. Keith Knudsen, are you here? Is Keith here?
He's
Yeah,
muted.
he just is muted right now.
There's
There he
Keith.
is.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Keith.
Hi, Keith.
You couldn't hear. He's right here.
Keith, are you here?
Yes.
I am, yes.
Oh, that's great. You apparently are a deputy director of the Earthquake Science Center of the U.S. Geological Survey. And we
That's
appreciate
true.
having you here to tell us what you can about what your committee does. And we appreciate that. So you are scheduled for 10 to 15 minutes, and we appreciate whatever it is you have to tell us. You have a very important committee assignment, and I can tell you that Bob and I have used the work of your committee.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So I have
You're
7 or 8 slides to share. So is it okay if I just assume control and go ahead and do that?
That's fine. You're in charge.
How's that? Does everyone see my slide? The first slide?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is a relatively informal meeting. So if I say something that's not clear, feel free to interrupt and ask me a question. I can't see people's raised hands, so just holler and let me know you'd like me to take a breath while you ask me something. So what I hope to cover today is I'll have a little bit about the information we make available right after an earthquake, so that when you are responding to a regional earthquake, you can learn as much as you are interested in as rapidly as you can. I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of earthquakes we expect in the Bay Area and the probabilities or the likelihood of different earthquakes on different faults. Then I'll talk about the different hazards that accompany earthquakes. There's shaking and liquefaction and landsliding and surface rupture, which I think many of you are familiar with in Portola Valley, and tsunami are the main hazards. And my main point about hazards is that for most earthquakes, shaking is the primary cause of damage. You may be particularly worried about surface rupture, but even in communities like yours, shaking is usually the primary driver of damage. If I have time, I have one slide about aftershocks that I'll show. And I hope that after this, maybe 10 minutes, I hope, I should probably keep track of the time. I'll turn on my, okay. I think this is a pretty educated audience. I think you recognize you live in earthquake country. You're at this meeting because you want to talk about that and figure out what to do. I hope you'll all go home from this meeting or go into another room of your home from this meeting, realizing that if you stay in the Bay Area long enough, you are likely to be exposed to pretty severe shaking from earthquakes. And it's best to just accept that and mitigate for that. Next, we have abundant information available for groups like yours to use in planning, mitigation, and response activities. And I'm sure Tim, the next speaker, and I would be happy to help you find things that might be of use to you. And then hopefully you will ask, are the buildings in our town safe, and are our residents prepared? So I'll start off with 2 slides about information available right after an earthquake. So when an earthquake occurs, really of any significant magnitude, I forget what the minimum magnitude is for which we generate what we call an event page. This is a web page that's generated for every significant earthquake around the world, for that matter, not just in the US. And this provides abundant information. I used to often get calls from reporters and people at emergency response desks in different jurisdictions asking me for information after an earthquake occurred. And my response is always, go to this page. This is where we put out what we know. So there's a variety of information. There are maps showing where the earthquake occurred. You can map faults on there. There's historical information. There's information from the Did You Feel It report. I hope after every local earthquake, you all go log into our Did You Feel It report and report how you experienced the earthquake. That information really based on the power of large numbers. The more responses we get, the more science use we can make of those responses. Shake map is a depiction, a map-based depiction of the geographic expression of intensity of shaking. Pager is a loss estimate, both in number of fatalities and in forecasted economic losses. I won't go over all these, but the 3 rectangles outlined with red are relatively new products. The one on the left is an aftershock forecast. So now after every, I believe it's magnitude 5 earthquake in the US, it might be 5.5, we put out an automated aftershock forecast. And a lot of people find these useful, particularly emergency response groups. Shake Alert is another relatively new product. This has been all over the news. This product is available to anyone who wants it, especially if you have a more modern cell phone. And what this product does is it once an earthquake begins, it alerts people in the area of the earthquake that shaking is headed their way. So that we call that Shake Alert or Earthquake Early Warning. And then that box in the top right is we now put out maps of anticipated areas of liquefaction and landsliding. So those are ground failure phenomena that typically accompany shaking. And Tim, I'll leave discussion of those hazards to Tim, who's your next speaker. This is just to show, this shows many of those same products, but it puts it in the form of a timeline. So before an earthquake occurs, we're continually working at probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, putting out maps of forecasts of future shaking that areas are likely to experience. And these maps are consulted by the building code. We also put out scenarios. So if an earthquake occurs on X fault and has an epicenter at such and such a place, what is the likely distribution of shaking given a certain magnitude? And that little map shows that. Then once an earthquake occurs, as I just described, we have earthquake early warning and our Shake Alert product. We also have an earthquake notification service. That's something you all might be interested in subscribing to too. If you just search online for USGS earthquake notification service, this is a service whereby you can set the parameters under which you are alerted, and you can be alerted via email or text, and you can decide what areas and what magnitude thresholds you'd like to be alerted when an earthquake for, what criteria you'd like to use in determining whether or not you get these alerts. I've talked about some of these other things, but the point is that we have information available for groups like yours to use now, forecasting future hazards, and then in the seconds and minutes to an hour or two after an earthquake, we have an abundance of information. Okay, I'm going to move on from the earthquake response category to talk a little bit about earthquake hazards in general. I hope this isn't a new map to any of you. I imagine most of you have seen this. The colored lines are the the faults that have in the geologically recent time produced surface rupturing earthquakes. And the little numbers on those are the probability of a magnitude 6.7 earthquake occurring over the 30-year period from 2014 to 2043, which is the last time we did this kind of study. So can you see, I don't know if you can see my arrow. Okay.
Yeah, yes.
So you're over somewhere in this area here along this red San Andreas fault down by the L or the T, I think. And so the San Andreas fault, we've calculated groups of experts, including representatives from the USGS and California Geological Survey that Tim represents, that there's a 22% likelihood of a magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake occurring on the San Andreas over that 30-year period. And we use magnitude 6.7 because that was the size of the Northridge earthquake that occurred in 1994. And we use the 30-year period because that, at least at one time, was the common duration of mortgages. The San Andreas probably isn't the most likely fault to produce a large earthquake in the Bay Area. The Hayward-Rogers Creek system is probably, in our view, more likely. And I live about 1 kilometer from the Hayward fault, so I'm in situations much like many of you find yourselves. This information in tabular form shares some of the same messages that that last slide showed. We called the report USERF, the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast. Tim was integrally involved in working on this for years. And this project puts out many, many reports, and some of my favorite are the ones that forecast the likelihood of different earthquakes, like I just talked about. But if we look at the lower table here, in the San Francisco region, we see that a magnitude 5 earthquake, the average repeat time in the San Francisco Bay Area is every 1.3 years. And there's virtually a 100% chance that we'll have a magnitude 5 over the 30-year period of this estimate. I'll note that in italics, recent studies have shown that if we look at sort of cumulative damage, it's the moderate to slightly large earthquakes that cause a great fraction of the damage that we can expect to experience. We have them, these moderate magnitudes, magnitude 5 and 6 and 6.5, much more often than we have larger earthquakes. So we should be thinking, you know, we often in these kinds of discussions talk about large earthquakes, magnitude 7, 7.5, earthquakes like the 1906 earthquake. But really we should be also talking about the not quite so large earthquakes that still do significant damage and occur much more frequently. And I list a few of the recent earthquakes there at the bottom right of the page. And we've learned a lot from each of those events. Okay, when we have earthquakes, again, the phenomenon that typically causes most damage is ground shaking. There are other what we call ground failure hazards or secondary hazards, landsliding, liquefaction, surface rupture, and then tsunami, which are additional hazards. But the hazard of ground shaking is typically what causes structures to have problems and collapse or have problems, and that's where we have injuries and deaths and the bulk of our financial losses. So it really pays to be thinking, it really pays for groups like yours to be thinking about ground shaking, not just where's the San Andreas fault. If you live that close to the San Andreas fault, you live close to other faults that are likely to host big earthquakes. So it's likely that your community sometime in the coming decades will experience strong shaking. So how do we as a society deal with and address shaking? Well, we have a building code. The building code is designed and has been, but not since really the 1970s, to address earthquake hazards. So buildings built before the 1970s really weren't designed to address the way we currently, or really weren't designed to address earthquake loadings. So any building built before then may be suspect. We have the National Seismic Hazard Map, which is a product put out by the USGS and collaborators that shows the probability of shaking from when we integrate the hazard from all faults in an area. Then there are design standard choices when new buildings are built or when we're assessing existing buildings. Do we want a building to provide us life safety, which is what the building code does, or do we want it to be occupiable right after an earthquake or somewhere in between? And those are decisions that proponents of new buildings, new development need to make. And often those discussions don't occur to the extent they should. People just assume that they should build according to the building code. Well, the building code provides life safety. It means that your building shouldn't kill you in an earthquake. It doesn't mean that your building is going to be useful following an earthquake. And you can have the same kind of thought process when thinking about evaluating existing buildings. And last is by mitigating and retrofit of structures. Normally, nearly all retrofit projects are to mitigate for earthquake shaking. And this map shows, it's a probabilistic map. It integrates potential shaking from all the faults in the Bay Area. And for any point on this map, we could develop what we call a hazard curve. We can think about the likelihood of different intensities of shaking at whatever frequency we're interested in. And the point of this map is that since the reds and pinks are showing the high intensity of shaking, the forecasted probabilistic high intensity of shaking, we should recognize that everywhere basically in the Bay Area is potentially subject to future strong ground motions or intense shaking. And these are examples of shake maps. In one case on the left, this shows a map of the intensity of shaking following the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. So here you are about up in here. So you're in the yellow, maybe in the orange level of intensity. I don't know how many of you were in the area following that event, but I'm sure you felt like you were shaken very strongly. Well, you should not, I hear too many times that we survived the Loma Prieta earthquake, we're gonna be fine. The Loma Prieta earthquake, its epicenter was way down here near Santa Cruz. There are faults that bisect the Bay Area that are likely to produce much stronger shaking in the future. And this shake map in the middle is for a scenario earthquake, a hypothetical earthquake, a magnitude 7.2 on the San Andreas Fault through the San Francisco Peninsula, excuse me. And you can look at just the distribution of intensity of colors. A more local, even a smaller earthquake on the San Andreas is likely to shake people in your neck of the woods much more intensely. So I talked to a lot of sort of public groups, and I hear a lot. I was here for 1989, my house or my structure did fine. This doesn't seem like a concern. And that's the wrong answer, I'll tell you. Okay, I have, this is my last slide, and then I'll hand the stage over to Tim. We've just had the recent Ridgecrest earthquake in 2019 in Southern California. And it's important for us to recognize that if we have a big earthquake, the time when we should most experience more earthquakes is right after big earthquakes. And those earthquakes that follow big earthquakes are called aftershocks. And this plot in the bottom here, the vertical axis is magnitude and the horizontal axis is time, and each tick represents just 24 hours, just one day. So back on July 4th, my family and I were driving up to the Sierra Nevada. We made a stop at our daughter's farm outside Winters. I got an ENS, the Earthquake Notification Service, notice on my phone that a magnitude 6.4 earthquake had just occurred. I called my boss at the USGS. We discussed what was going on, what sort of response we needed to make to that magnitude 6.4. Some of my colleagues did actually go in the field for that. And we together decided that maybe I shouldn't continue up to the mountains. Maybe I should go home just in case something bigger happened. And about, I think it was 18 hours later, I forget exactly how much later, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake occurred, which did much more damage. And this plot is to show you that every one of these little circles represents an aftershock from that magnitude 7.1 and magnitude 6.4 earthquake. And if you look closely, you'll see that the density of the dots decays with time. So the number of aftershocks decays with time, but the magnitude of those aftershocks doesn't necessarily decay. So you can have a magnitude 7.1 and the largest aftershock could occur months or even years after the main shock. The number of aftershocks decays with time, the magnitude doesn't necessarily. And oh, I had one more slide. So one of the reasons I talk to groups like yours is I'm a big fan of doing mitigation, working before the earthquake occurs to make it so that we have less damage following the next earthquake. And Tom Broker, who's a colleague of mine, and Jack Boatwright, who Pat knows really well, and I worked on this study a couple of years ago, basically just looking online from reports of newspapers and things of big projects that were investments made to mitigate earthquake impacts. And we found, just in the Bay Area, and we found that since 1989, a minimum of $73 to $80 billion has been invested in earthquake mitigation projects. And you can see by these two pie charts, the types of projects and the locations of these projects. That's probably a way that this way underestimates, because there are lots of projects that we didn't find evidence of online, but I'm sure are occurring. For example, my house isn't included here. But my hope is that you all will be part of these statistics the next time someone chooses to pursue this, and that you'll be making investments and making your community safer, not just in planning for responding to an earthquake, but taking actions now to make it so that your community will experience less damage in the next earthquake. And this is my introductory slide for Tim, because he's going to talk about the various ground failure phenomenon, which CGS, his employer, does a great job in characterizing. So I'll stop sharing my screens unless people have questions about particular slides.
I have a question, if I may, Keith.
Yeah, sure.
Hi. If we go back to one of your earliest slides, it was the earthquake notifications. It's a screen that had there we are. How can people sign up to get these?
So if you just search for USGS Earthquake Notification Service, that'll take you to a place where you set up an account. It asks you where you live and what area you're interested in receiving notifications from, and what and it draws a polygon for you, or you can draw the polygon, and then it asks you how you would like to receive. There's a form to fill out. So in the form, you describe whether you'd like to get a text message or an email. And it's not nearly as fast as Shake Alert and Earthquake Early Warning, but typically the ENS messages come out in a few minutes after an earthquake is sensed.
Okay, sometimes there's a full report written, or a fairly detailed report written. How long does it take for those to come out?
Well, sometimes years.
Oh no, I don't mean no. Don't mean that.
But if we look at let's see, if I go back one more, on the regional information page, there's typically a section called a Tectonic Summary, and that we have some of those canned, ready to go up. So if an earthquake occurs in this area, this block of text is pulled out of our database and put on our website, on the website for this earthquake. Other times we have to write them. And so that can take, an hour or 2 or 3 to get that, what we call the Tectonic Summary up.
Okay, yeah, because maybe that's what I've seen, because some of them have gone up surprisingly quickly after an earthquake.
Yeah, I'm getting pressed to pull together tectonic summaries that we can have sitting in a database somewhere for all the potential earthquakes, not all the potential, but for all the regions of California that might produce earthquakes. And I'm a little reluctant to do that, as you can imagine. That's a big project.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you. Does someone else have questions?
So
no one has questions.
Are these illustrations available online for anybody?
Yes, everything I've showed you, we have no secrets. This is all, in fact, this website, this view that I'm showing right now is what we call the event page. I copied this off of the web for this earthquake after the Petrolia earthquake a few months ago. So this is information completely available to the public. We like to get as much information out as we can, and we're proud of the new product we've put out.
Yeah. The aftershock forecast is particularly interesting.
Could you tell us the URL for this page so that we could get to it?
So every earthquake will have its own event page and its own URL. But if you go to earthquake.usgs.gov, there's a little place in the top right of that page that says recent earthquakes. And you click on that and it will provide you a map and a list of recent earthquakes. Earthquake.usgs.gov.
Thank you.
Or if you subscribe to the earthquake notification service, I think there, whenever you receive a notification, there's a link to take you to this page for that particular earthquake.
Rusty has a question.
I asked it. Thank you. That was it.
Okay.
Yes, I thank you too. This has been a marvelous presentation. I'm glad that all of this information is available to us at any time.
Yeah.
Thanks, Keith.
Yeah, thank you so much, Keith.
Oh, you're welcome.
Wonderful presentation.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
appreciate this very much.
Sure, and again,
on you again sometime.
well, my offer was sincere. If there's information we can provide that will help you in your efforts, if Pat can't dig it up, I can help her.
Thanks.
All right.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
I have a question.
Is that Mary? Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Is there a place for this kind of information on the website, on an emergency preparedness type site under your committee? How would it best be promulgated from the town's point of view?
I think that's an interesting question that needs to be considered. So it's maybe something we should do, link to the USGS website possibly if there's an earthquake. So yeah, is that something that might be of interest? Mary?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, if most people, I mean, they will go, we did all turn to the town at the time of the earthquake. And there was, I won't say anything more about that, but I think having it show up on the town site automatically if there is an earthquake would be extremely helpful.
Okay.
The link, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
some people don't have to go searching. They'll know where to go.
Right.
I think, Nan, this is something that we on the committee can work on. We can think about how to get information out ourselves or help people who wonder what to do next or where do they get information next. We now have learned a good deal about what's available from the USGS, and we're soon going to learn about what's available from the California Geological Survey. But we need, as a committee, to have a lot of this information more familiar to each one of us and somehow be able to respond ourselves if an event takes place nearby. So are there any more questions for Keith? If not, we can move on to Timothy. Timothy Dawson.
I'm here.
Oh, good. Thank you for being here. You apparently are a senior engineer for the California Geological Survey, which is apparently part of the California Department of Conservation. So please tell us what you can that will help us understand Portola Valley better.
I'll try. Thanks for inviting me, everyone. Let me share my screen. And I can start the presentation. Okay. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, again, thanks for having me. When I was invited by Pat to talk about this, the ask was to kind of focus in on Portola Valley, and it's an area, as you might soon find out, it's kind of near and dear to my heart. Thanks to Keith for really setting the stage for me to talk about this, because in California, I represent the California Geological Survey, and our mission is it's California focused, and there's several seismic hazards in California, as Keith mentioned, that are actually regulated by the state in terms of laws and regulations. The shaking hazard, strong ground motion, that's really taken care of in the California building code for the most part. And that you can kind of see an example of what shaking does to a building here in the center photo here. And then the things that CGS really focuses on are surface fault rupture. And you can see an example of the fault up in the upper right here. This is from the 1992 Landers earthquake, where the fault actually breaks the surface of the ground, moves, can tear apart buildings. Other things that can happen during an earthquake are liquefaction. This is the Marina district in the lower right. And this damage is partly caused by the liquefaction that occurred in the Marina district as a result of the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. We could have earthquake-induced landslides, as you can see up here at the top center. This is, I think, is a photo also from the Loma Prieta earthquake along the coast. Oops, I just went backwards. And then more recently, we've had a lot of focus in California and at CGS on the tsunami hazard. That's something that you don't have to worry about too much in Portola Valley, but that's also covered by regulations in the state under the Seismic Hazards Mapping Act. And so a lot of what we do at CGS is we try to map these hazards and produce these regulatory maps, which I'll talk about in a few slides. So as I mentioned, Portola Valley is a really interesting place, and it's sort of ground zero for geologic hazard mitigation in my mind. These photos here on the left, they're taken out of the Lawson report. This was a huge report. It's 3 or 4 inches thick that was produced by Andrew Lawson and others shortly after the 1906 earthquake. These photos are specifically from Portola Valley, showing the San Andreas fault and the effects of damage. Here's a photo of this fault, of the fault scarp denoted by the arrows, sense of motions denoted by the arrows. It cuts through this house, which I believe is still standing. I keep doing this. But that's one place. The area was canvassed by geologists after the 1906 earthquake, mostly from Stanford, in particular this area. Here's a photo on the lower part of this image. I believe that's Alpine Road. It's a little bit more narrow than it is today. It looks quite a bit different than what it looks like now when I ride my bike across it sometimes. But anyway, we can jump ahead about 50 years when this area was under a lot of development pressure. And Portola Valley in particular was sort of a hub of scientists, earth scientists from USGS and Stanford University. They had a lot of concerns about different geologic hazards that could exist in their community at the time. And they were really at the forefront in forward thinking in terms of how to deal with these hazards. So I know there's people in this Zoom room that know a lot more about the history of this than I do. And I'll ask for the forgiveness if I get this wrong, but really the foresight that was shown by the folks in Portola Valley to establish these ways to mitigate their geologic hazards it's quite impressive. And it started in the sort of mid 60s where they started requiring geologic considerations for new developments. They had a town geologist. I think this may be one of the first places where there's a geologist on staff for a local community. They hired a professor, I think at Stanford, to produce a fault map of where the San Andreas fault crosses through Portola Valley that would help the town kind of plan for the development and how to avoid these faults. And they also appointed committees such as yourself to kind of review this And so in the center here, this is an excerpt from, I think, the report that was submitted to Portola Valley back in the 1970s, where the fault was mapped, and then the town developed these setbacks. So areas which I believe at the time they were hoping not to allow development. So you wouldn't want to build a building across a trace of the San Andreas Fault in these areas. And so you can see these setbacks kind of vary in width. But it was really innovative at the time. That's why I kind of call this early Silicon Valley innovation. Instead of computers, it was focused on geologic hazard mitigation. Around the same time, there was an earthquake in Southern California. It's called the Silmar or San Fernando earthquake in 1971. Let's see, February of 1971. And this is really what got the state's attention in terms of geologic hazards. This thing wants to go ahead of itself sometimes. I apologize for that. But anyway, the sort of key lessons learned from the surface fault rupture that happened during that earthquake was that the damage was localized near fault zones. This is something that people had suspected for a long time. And then the other lesson was that if someone, a geologist, for instance, had done a site-specific study, they could have identified the fault ahead of time and may perhaps avoided the fault building across the fault. And so these key lessons became what's now known as the Alquist-Priolo Earthquake Fault Zoning Act of 1972. This was a state law introduced as Senate Bill 520 by Senator Alfred Alquist and Assemblyman Paul Priolo. Originally, I think it was going to be more expansive. They wanted to address a broader scope of earthquake deformation hazards, such as landslides, liquefaction. At the time, it was a little bit too hard to deal with that. They weren't as well understood as they are today. So upon the recommendation of Professor Richard Johns from Stanford University, they decided to focus on just surface fault rupture. And so this became law. And this slide here summarizes sort of the key moving parts within the AP Act. The state geologist office, that's now the California Geological Survey. Our main tasks under the AP Act is we evaluate the faults throughout the state, and then we designate what are called earthquake fault zones of investigation. There's a few other things we do, but really that's most of the work we do related to the AP Act. And also this applies to another act, the Seismic Hazard Mapping Act, which is very modeled on the AP Act and is very similar in a lot of ways. For a town like yourself, the Portola Valley, under the AP Act, you're responsible for updating general plans, your safety elements, which I think you're involved with right now. You're also required to have or require site investigations for new developments. And then you're also charged with reviewing and improving those projects based on the results of those site investigations. And finally, the property owners, they're the final piece of this puzzle. They're actually responsible for determining if the hazard's present through a geologic investigation. That geologist conducting that project will avoid the hazard either for the AP Act just by defining a setback, or for other types of hazards requiring other types of mitigation. And then there's a property disclosure requirement. If that property sold, the buyer has to be notified that it's in one of these hazard zones. So again, the Alquist-Priolo Earthquake Fault Zoning Act is much older. It only addresses the hazard to surface fault rupture. And then on the right here, following the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, the state passed the Seismic Hazards Act of 1990, and that is focused on liquefaction and earthquake-induced landslides, and also tsunami zones. So the way that CGS releases these products after when we do our mapping and identify these different zones is that they're what we call regulatory earthquake zones or required investigation maps. That's this map that you see here on the right. I'll just make a point that these are not exclusion zones or setback zones. These are zones of investigation, required investigation. So before development happens within one of these zones, there has to be a geologist or geotechnical engineer involved with addressing whether that hazard is present or not. And so these maps include earthquake fault zones, the seismic hazard zones, again, which are the liquefaction and earthquake-induced landslides, and also tsunami zones, which is not on this map. And then if a geologist identifies one of these hazards within these zones, it has to be mitigated in some form. And I'll just finally point out on this map is that CGS, we don't regularly update these maps for the earthquake fault zones. This map, which includes Portola Valley, hasn't been updated since the mid-70s. And we actually have plans this year to start working on updating these maps for this area, as well as the entire San Francisco Peninsula. It's been way too long. We finally have the resources to do that, as well as a lot of new data that can be brought to bear on refining our fault zone mapping. So I generated this figure just because it's focused on Portola Valley. That's that blue line, I believe. That's the boundaries of Portola Valley. And this just shows what the fault traces that have been mapped along the San Andreas Fault are. And then the zones of required investigation, the earthquake fault zones that we established around traces of the San Andreas Fault. In general, the fault zone, these zones are about 500 feet on either side of a mapped fault trace. The criteria is that the fault trace has to be associated with a fault that's active, which means it's moved within the last 11,700 years is the age criteria we use, or associated with a fault that's moved within that time period. And the other bit of criteria that we use is that it has to be well-defined in that a geologist can actually map it on the ground and at least locate it at a reasonable scale within one of these, within our mapping area. Here's the same area of Portola Valley showing the liquefaction and earthquake-induced landslide zones that CGS has produced. So the green that you see on this map, those are the liquefaction areas of liquefaction, areas of potential liquefaction. Let me say it that way. So it doesn't mean that liquefaction will happen during an earthquake. It just says that it meets certain criteria where it's possible that liquefaction could happen. And there's really three ingredients that go into that analysis. There's the possibility that there's strong shaking that could generate liquefaction. And by virtue of the San Andreas Fault being there in this area, that's one fault that can cause liquefaction, although there are others in the Bay Area that could possibly trigger liquefaction. The other ingredients are areas of high groundwater, either presently or in the past. That's shallow groundwater. That's another ingredient that you need to have liquefaction. And then the final ingredient is the geologic materials that are in the subsurface, which are usually loose sands, gravels, things that aren't well compacted. In the blue are the areas that we've defined as have the potential of earthquake-induced landslides. Again, similar ingredients go into this. It's the proximity to a shaking source and the possibility that strong shaking can trigger a landslide. It's the rock strength characteristics. If the rock is especially soft or prone to landsliding, that's something that goes into this analysis to define these zones. And then other things such as bedding attitudes, whether it's dipping in a certain way that could cause it to slide during an earthquake, as well as slope, so the steepness of the slope. So you can see that most of these earthquake-induced landslide zones are in the areas of steep slopes within Portola Valley. And then here's just an image showing these overlapping zones. So sort of have the trifecta of three different types of earthquake hazard zones with ground deformation potential in these areas. And again, Doesn't mean that these hazards are going to happen everywhere. It just means that there's a potential for this to happen, and the zones are really meant to guide investigations prior to development. And then here's a map just showing some of the other faults in the area. This is out of the USGS CSGS Quaternary Fault Database. So these are faults that have moved within the last 1.6 million years is the USGS criteria for Quaternary active. So we have faults such as the Pilorcitas Fault to the west that have been mapped, the Baracol Fault here, the Hermit Fault crosses a bit of Portola Valley here in the northeast, and then the Monte Vista Fault Zone. And the colors are sort of depict what we sort of know about these faults in terms of its age of recency of movement. Whoops, did that again. So red are faults that moved historically. So that'd be the 1906 earthquake along the San Andreas Fault. Orange faults are faults that have moved during the Holocene, perhaps. It's thought that parts of the Monte Vista Fault have moved within the last 11,000, 12,000 years. That's based on just a few data points, not on this map, but further to the south. And then faults that have moved sometime within the last 1.6 million years are in the purple here. And so just to let you know that we have looked into trying to zone the Monte Vista Shannon Fault Zone, this orange fault here in this corner of the map. It's been very difficult for us to find enough data to meet the criteria for our zones, unfortunately. So it's still not been zoned, but that does not preclude local jurisdictions from establishing their own zones. I believe the city of Cupertino, Los Gatos, they may have their own zones. I'm not sure about Portola Valley around this fault for geologic investigations and mitigation. So the one thing that we've tried pretty hard within the last few years is to make this data more easily available. That first map I showed a few slides back, we used to release these as sort of 7.5 minute quadrangle maps, which makes it very difficult for someone like in the city of Portola Valley to piece together these zones, because Portola Valley is in 3 or 4 different quad-based maps. So we've put this data all online for the public. The easiest thing to do to check to see if you're in one of these zones is go to our EQZ app, that's Earthquake Zone app online. It's on the CGS website. The easiest way to find it, you can look at the URL here, but I typically, when I look for this, this tool, I just Google EQZ app, and it should be one of the top hits that come up. And so the nice thing about this tool is that you can just type in your address. It'll bring up, it'll zoom into the address, and it'll bring up this window saying what zones you might be in. So here, I think I select this parcel that was, I think it's like where the Windy Hill open space is that I hike up occasionally. And so it has the street address. It says that, oh, look, part of this parcel is within an earthquake fault zone. Part of it's also within a liquefaction zone and a landslide zone as well. So this tool, it's public, it's free, and I think it's pretty handy for anyone wanting to know about their local zones they might be in. We've also put this data online as GIS services. So this is for consultants, for local cities that have a GIS department to import this data directly from our servers. So it's always up to date for them, rather than relying on perhaps outdated material that's been sent to them in the past. So this is sort of the big resource we have for cities and communities like yourself to understand these different seismic hazard zones. The other thing we've done in the past, which I think your committee would be really interested in looking at, just to understand like the AP Act as well as the Seismic Hazard Zone Act, is we have some guidance documents out there. This one is CGS Special Publication 42, which is specific to the Alquist-Friel Earthquake Fault Zoning Act. This was actually done. We assembled a technical advisory panel, which included Ted Sayer, who I believe was your town geologist at one point. He has just a ton of experience and expertise, and so he was incredibly helpful for helping us draft this document. And really, it's geared for providing guidance for how to implement the requirements of the AP Act. And it's targeted, there's different chapters targeted to different audiences to help them understand how the AP Act affects them. So there's a chapter for government agencies, there's a chapter for property owners, and then also sort of a chapter geared for geoscience, geologists, engineers, to understand what the standards of practice are for assessing these hazards in your area or in these areas that have been zoned. A little bit older document is similar to Special Publication 42. This is Special Publication 117, which deals with the other seismic hazard zones, the earthquake-induced landslides and liquefaction zones. It's a very similar document to what Special Publication 42 is, just on different topics. And then probably not as much interest to you, or there's guidance document for tsunamis, which is Special Report 241. So just my final kind of thoughts and take-home points for this presentation is that I really appreciate that Portola Valley has been at the forefront of geologic hazard mitigation for over 50 years. They really kind of helped inspire the model for hazard mitigation in the state. Again, I've said this before, that these hazard zones are zones of required investigation. They're not exclusion zones. I understand that within your community, these smaller areas are more likely considered setback zones. And then, as I mentioned before, these maps need updating. So I think you can expect to see updated maps for the San Andreas Fault on the peninsula, perhaps by early next year. We hope to bring in all this new LiDAR data. We hope to bring in some of the new great work that's been done in Portola Valley about actually locating the 1906 trace better into our updated maps. The other point is that not all the faults in Portola Valley are zoned by the state, and the Monte Vista fault's one of those that, while it may be Holocene active, we haven't been able to zone it just because it hasn't met our criteria yet. It's especially challenging. That doesn't preclude that you can do something with it in the more immediate term future. And then we also have all these resources that we can provide. And I've sent this presentation to Pat, and so you feel free to review it. And I'm here to answer any questions that you might have about these zones. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. That was great.
Very thorough report, and I'm glad that you could focus on Portola Valley as much as you did. That was great. Does anybody have any further comments for Timothy?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Ann Copsill. Thank you so much. On that fault kind of exclusion zone, of course, I can see why it's bad to build a structure that straddles a fault, right? But the distances away, the 50 or 100 feet, that seems so close. Does that really buy you that much? It seems still way too close to a fault.
It's remarkable that, you know, people, I've heard comments like yours, and I've heard people from the other side who say, well, this is too generous sometimes. The remarkable thing is that we've learned that if you can identify the fault ahead of time and avoid it, you can be pretty close to the fault and it not damage the building through surface fault rupture. That's specifically for surface fault rupture. Now, that building is going to shake pretty hard during an earthquake. As Keith mentioned in the previous talk, the ground motions can be extreme. And so if it's not built to withstand the ground motions and you're near close proximity to the fault that causes the earthquake. That can cause damage. But, you know, I didn't include this slide, but there's a number of examples where people have built really close to a fault that's ruptured, and the building itself has not experienced damage from the surface fault rupture. And there's, you know, in 2014, there was a earthquake up in Napa. And I happen to know a guy that lives literally 3 feet from where the fault ruptured. It just missed the corner of his house, and his house was just fine. The surface rupture didn't disturb it. Now, if it had been going through the center of his house, I don't know if that would be the case. But I think a lot of engineers believe that you can build pretty close to a fault that ruptures without it having that much damage.
I see, thanks. I was thinking about the shaking has got to be just about as bad 50 feet away as.
Yeah, the shaking can be quite intense.
But there's a chance of building strong enough to withstand shaking. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Tim, hi, Nan Shostak. Could you talk for a second about the difference in shaking? If you're right up, 100 feet from the fault, or 1,000 feet, or a kilometer, or I'm mixing units, or 25 kilometers or 50.
I could talk in really general terms. I'm not a seismologist, and I don't pay as much attention to the ground motion models in general. The closer you are to the causative fault, the more intense the shaking, and it tends to what we call attenuate with distance, or the shaking decreases with distance. And you could have, if you looked at some of Keith's shake maps that he presented, you could kind of see that, like for instance, the Loma Prieta earthquake, the red colors, which signified more intense shaking, were sort of more centered in general in Santa Cruz, and then the colors got lighter because the modeled shaking or the recorded shaking decreased with distance. There's exceptions to that. Sometimes local geologic conditions, even far away from a fault, can amplify shaking, but just in a really general sense, that's how it works.
So does the attenuation, okay, so in Keith's maps, which were very small scale, so sort of high altitude view, there was a red swath along the San Andreas, and we're probably all in the red. But if you zoom in to a larger scale, can you really make a distinction in Portola Valley between something near 280 and something very close to the house close to the San Andreas, if it's the San Andreas that ruptures?
I really can't answer that question. I'm not knowledgeable enough about how near field ground motions and shaking work. I don't know if Keith could chime in if he's still here.
Is Keith still with us? Yeah. Hi, Keith. Near field versus not quite near field?
Yeah. Well, we're a little bit hampered in answering that question because there just aren't that many instruments that have been right by an earthquake, many seismic instruments to measure shaking that have been positioned right by an earthquake fault that ruptures and generates shaking. So there's even a little bit of evidence that right at the fault, the shaking might be a little bit lower, but the jury's really out on that. But, if you're within 10 kilometers, 15, 20 kilometers of a big earthquake on the San Andreas Fault, the shaking will be intense. So that it's sort of levels of severe shaking. Predicting the intensity of shaking depends, as Tim just described, on how far you are from the event, the magnitude of the earthquake, and most importantly, the kind of soil that your structure is sitting on, and whether it's on, for example, a basin or thick, soft soils or on bedrock. So knowing those kinds of things might be more useful than trying to discriminate likely shaking based on differences of hundreds of meters or even kilometers from the fault.
So we should all consider ourselves in the red zone. on your map.
I can remember that the town of Portola Valley struggled quite a bit in trying to come up with how close you could build to a fault. This was in the 1960s. And so Portola, it was a struggle even for the committee to determine how close you should build to a fault if the trace is actually known well, versus how close should you be if the trace is not very well known. These are difficult things to work with. There's nothing precise about them, but the town of Portola Valley took a step and came up with some numbers that are in the town ordinances now. So the town of Portola Valley has done what it could to help future construction.
Well, again, remember that's to address those struggles that you just described. And Portola Valley, as Tim described, has been in a leadership position in thinking about this. But that's to address the surface rupture hazard.
Yes.
And that is so when the fault ruptures to the ground surface, you're avoiding having a structure built in an area that's going to be offset at the ground surface. That's one earthquake hazard. Nan was asking about shaking from earthquakes, which is a completely different earthquake hazard, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is Bob. I'm Chet's son, but there are three people who got their hands up, and the first person was Karen. So, Karen.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. I've been focused on wildfire mostly, but I had a question that's sort of the intersection here, in that we've been thinking that what would be the possibility that an earthquake could rupture some sort of gas line that would start a fire and potentially a wildfire, and particularly that the San Andreas Fault hits our evacuation routes for some people on Alpine and some people on Portola, and is how, I would just love some expert advice on what is the probability of that happening in today's environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As you know, there's in a lot of communities, there's buried infrastructure such as gas lines that have to cross the fault. I mean, you have to get gas from one side of a town to another, and they vary in size, to major distribution hubs to little service lines that go to individual homes. But we've seen from past earthquakes that these things can break during earthquakes. The other thing that you might want to be aware of is that the same thing can happen with these other ground deformation hazards. Liquefaction can disrupt buried gas lines. Landslides could break a gas line. And with any one of these instances, there is the potential that a fire could be triggered from a gas line. So, there's, for the major distribution lines, there's been a lot of thought put into how to mitigate those. So, is for like a major pipeline that comes into the Bay Area, perhaps PG&E might have some sort of mitigation shut-off valves on either side of the fault. But for a lot of these smaller gas lines, I'm not sure what's been done at this point. That's probably a question better posed to someone who maintains this infrastructure.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions?
Yeah, there's two more. One's with Rusty.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim, for an excellent presentation. I'm curious about the different types of fault, and perhaps you could speak a little bit about that. For example, the difference between a strike slip fault and a reverse or reverse oblique fault. What's been done to characterize the different types of fault that exist within Portola Valley, and how those different faults are regulated under the Alquist-Priolo Act?
Yeah, so we know that the San Andreas Fault's a strike slip fault, and that's just where the fault is sliding past each other. It's part of the plate boundary. So the east the east side of town's sort of moving to the southeast relative to the west side of town, which is sliding to the northwest on the Pacific plate versus the North American plate, just to put it really simply. So that's a fault we understand a lot. Now, these faults that I showed, like the Monte Vista Shannon fault zone, that's sort of on the east side of Portola Valley, my understanding is that that's a reverse fault. And so that's where one side of the fault moves up relative to the other. And the way that it's been mapped is that the west side of the fault's moving up and over the east side of the fault. And so that's a different type of motion. And that's caused also, I mean, it's related to the San Andreas fault system. There's just a little bit of compression going across the coast ranges. And that compression is manifested as these reverse faults along the foothills system that's sort of the west side of the Santa Clara Valley and bounds these hills.
Got something, Bob. I can't sit any longer.
Does that answer your question?
Well, and how are these different faults regulated by the?
Oh yeah, the second. So far right now, the San Andreas is regulated by the AP Act. We've zoned it. And then the Monte Vista Shannon fault system on the east side of town, that's not regulated by these state fault zones. We've had a hard time finding enough evidence to justify establishing one of these zones. And we have probably a little bit more strict criteria than local jurisdictions have into doing that. So as I mentioned, some of these other local communities have regulated those faults. I think the town of Los Gatos has. I haven't looked at your maps, but they've established these fault zones that require sort of the same types of investigations on these lesser known faults.
I don't mean to probe here, but the question really isn't about a specific fault; it's about a type of fault.
Okay.
So the Alquist-Priola regulates on a strike slip. It's pretty easy to see surface deformation, surface movement, but on a reverse fault, it's harder to detect that. So my question was, how does Alquist-Priola address those faults?
Yeah. Okay, I understand your question now. Yeah, is to the extent that we can map the fault with a degree of precision that meets a criteria that we have, that it breaks the surface, it really doesn't matter what kind of fault it is. So strike slip faults, we'll zone those. There are a number of reverse faults in California that we've zoned, in Southern California in particular. And then normal faults, which have the opposite motion as reverse faults, such as in Eastern California, we've also zoned those. But the real challenge we have in reverse faults are really tricky because sometimes they don't quite break the surface. They might just deform the surface over maybe a broader aperture. We call those faults blind faults because in a lot of cases, they don't break the surface. They just kind of warp the surface. And we don't tend to focus on those as much. It just isn't something that meets the criteria of our zoning program right now. We've talked about it a lot in the past about how to do that, but they're really tricky faults, these reverse faults in a lot of cases.
My son Bob and I have been looking at the geology around where we live in Portola Valley. I mean, within a half a mile or more, and we recognize that there probably is a lot more that could be done to understand, especially thrust faults. There's much that could be done, and it kind of begs to be done. Nothing has been done and for a long time. It's difficult work.
Yeah, thanks. It makes it especially difficult when the area has been developed, which is a lot of California these days. So the most densely populated areas in California which are affected by these faults are ones that have been built over and they've come through and destroyed a lot of the geologic evidence.
But it's amazing the information that becomes available. We just found some maps that were made by Professor Branner's students in 1906, 1906 to 1908. Maps have just been released, and they show all kinds of interesting things that even students could see quite clearly in those days, and that nobody seems to know much about today. But we've certainly tuned into them because we think our house is probably on top of a thrust fault. Thrust faults are very dangerous. Only a little bit of vertical movement can do incredible damage to a house.
Hi, folks. I need to take off. It's been a pleasure to hear about what you're doing, your efforts, and if I can help in the future, please let me know.
We may well call on you, Timothy. Thank you very much for an extremely interesting talk.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you, Keith.
This has been great. Just what we needed.
I can stick around and answer the lingering questions, or try.
Okay.
I see a couple of hands up. I'm not.
Well, I have one. Is it my turn?
Yes.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, committee, for meeting. This has been very interesting, and Tim, for your presentation. I was particularly interested in the wide swath of the liquefaction zone that paralleled the was wider than the San Andreas Fault. And if you've taken a look at our town maps, so this is perhaps a question that intersects your map, Tim, and our town maps. Our town map includes a separate zone for ground movement, potential ground movement. And yet your liquefaction zone is broader yet, and even encompasses my home. So that caught my attention. But just generally, I was interested if you and the committee were going to be in dialogue about improving our maps if that were appropriate.
With respect to, I think with respect to the fault zones, I'm sure we'll be in touch with whoever your town geologist is right now, as well as the local scientists in the area, such as Chet, who knows a lot more about where the fault traces are. With the liquefaction zones, those are sort of done to a consistent standard around the state, where we take those three ingredients that I discussed earlier: the ground motion potential, the water table information, and then the sort of geologic materials that underlie that. That's really how we define our liquefaction zones. They may be sort of a little bit more conservative. That is a little bit larger than what you might have in your town plan. So,
yes, they are definitely larger than, and if that's the definition of more conservative, I don't know. Accuracy, as accurate as we can get is, I think, what we're all after. And as we are being asked to consider potential housing sites, and a number of which fall within this zone, I think it would be important to dial in on the accuracy of the liquefaction zone.
Yeah. Again, these zones that the state produces, they're really intended as zones of required investigation. So if anyone wants to build a major development in these areas, then they would have to do an investigation. There's also exemptions for these things. Like a typical single family home there wouldn't be a requirement to do that sort of investigation, depending on the type of development. But that's really something that your town planner would be aware of, and and all the rules that go behind that.
If I may,
thank you.
If I may, through the chair, this is Jeff Alfs. Most projects in town do end up either requiring or doing a soil analysis, which includes liquefaction potential. I mean, my house has 15 to 20 foot piers under it, which reach around to bedrock specifically to avoid both slide and liquefaction. And it's I think most projects in town would address liquefaction during their sort of soil analysis and their design process.
If I could follow on, that was a very interesting add-on. Thank you, Jeff. And hearkening back to Karen's earlier point about the utility lines that run through that, I guess we would put piers under gas lines? Well, we're not going to have gas lines. So in any case, it's an area of interest, and thank you for dialing in. I appreciate the answer.
Oh, if I may, Betsy, I think we're going to have gas lines for quite a while. New construction probably won't have them, but there are so many existing houses with gas lines that cross the fault, the San Andreas, the other faults, that we're going to have to be aware of the possibility of gas line rupture for a while. Okay.
Any further questions?
Looks like Christy has one.
I'm not
Yes,
aware. Christy?
Yes, thank you. I was interested in when you talked about the mitigation shutoff valves that PG&E may have on either side of Portola Road. Can we get some more information from our town regarding what would happen if in fact there are shutoff valves? Who comes, how quickly? Because we know gas can cause fire, and that's one of our main concerns here. I'd love more information from the town on that. And then I just used your map to plug in my address, and it didn't have any information. It looked like all across the street from me. So if it is if there's no information, where do we go from here? I guess that's my question.
Well, that means that you're not in a zone of required investigation as defined by the state, which is good.
Yeah, I guess I still would love the information. So is our town planning to do some more investigation?
Wait, you mean on the gas line valves?
Oh, that's a separate, looking into the gas line and the shutoff valves and our process and insurance to the residents is my first question. Second question, if we're not on the map and we can't get the information, is the town planning to do a more extensive mapping? Thank you.
I don't think this committee is in a position to answer that question.
Well, I'm hoping in the future, hopefully you can make recommendations. I know you're early in the process, but I guess that's my question. Thank you.
Any further questions? I think it's been a very good meeting. We've learned a lot from Timothy and Keith and from the questions that have been asked. So the committee is going to be aware of the needs of the town to know more, and I'm glad that we have established a schedule for meetings, and we'll do our best to keep the community informed from our point of view. If there are no more questions, we can bring this particular session to an end, and so this meeting of the Geologic Safety Committee is now over. Thank you.
Tim, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you,
This
Tim.
is great.
Yes, thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Wonderful presentations.
Right.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Tim.
You can always shoot me an email or whatever if you have any additional questions from the committee. I think Pat knows how to get a hold of me. So,
Okay.
all right.
Great.
Yeah, thank
All
you
right.
for the offer.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I guess that's it.